In this video, I'd like to, if I may, to go to an area of possible confusion around the area of leadership traits, and also to explain that, and then to move on and talk about the whole question of firefighting as a philosophy for doing what we sometimes do at work. So let's start with the leadership traits, and if you remember last time there was one particular trust factor of the 7 trust factors we talked about, which was reliability and consistency. Now it also happens that another of the leadership traits is flexibility. So we can be consistent and we can be flexible, but how will that work, and how does the word context help us? So if we are consistent in our behaviours, people will trust us, and that's a good thing. If we are flexible, people will see us in a good light, provided that flexibility is appropriate. So how do we do flexibility and consistency as well? Well, the first thing is we don't do them at the same time. What we are doing is within a given context to behave in a consistent way, even though those particular ways may be very, very different. So what does that mean? What's an example of that? So let's imagine there's something that's very, very urgent takes place, and instead of a facilitating style, things need to be done, and one finds oneself, and other people will be doing it as well, saying, oh, do that, this needs doing, yeah, and the next thing is. So that can take place. Now if we move from a facilitation to that style with no context, no reason for that in a sort of crazy way, then people are not quite sure how to take us. It doesn't look right, there's something odd about it, and people definitely will not trust us. However, if the context is the same in each of those situations where we behave in that particular way, we are still behaving in a consistent way, although flexible, with that flexibility that depends on the context. So really wanted to explain that, because otherwise these two words seem to be in conflict, and they're not. The next thing I'd like to talk about is firefighting, and it may not be applicable to you, but one of the things certainly I've noticed in the last decade or so is that at one time the most senior people were generally pretty relaxed, and they had reasonably balanced lives and didn't work massively long hours. And they also had personal assistants and secretaries, of course. Now a lot of that has changed, so people right at the top very often don't have the support that they used to have, and a lot of them are starting their day and finishing their day with an hour and a half of emails. And that is not very, very helpful in some ways, because we end up just firefighting. In other words, we think, we decide, and then we act. And when we think, decide and act, and we do that in a patterned way, it's very possible to just get more and more stress. We'll talk about stress later on, but more into that habit of what we call firefighting, just moving from one thing to the next. And you might say, well, that's my business, that's what happens. But it isn't strictly what we're paid for. Certainly at higher levels of management, we don't want to be running around all the time fixing things. If we're fixing things, we're not looking at the future, not at the midterm and not at the long term. Now later on we'll be, I think probably in the next series, be looking at specifics in terms of, well, what strategically should I be thinking of? But the obvious things would be things like personal plans for your own development, how you influence people, particularly stakeholders of whatever status they are, people who can influence and alter how your area and how you are perceived in your environment, and also to make people plans. In other words, how do you develop people, how do you cover for them if they leave or move on, how do you develop all of that stuff? That needs strategic thought. Now the problem with starting the day with firefighting is that we tend to get hyped up, and we tend to get excited by it, and we get sucked into this cycle of think, decide, action, and it doesn't really let go. So how can we change that? Well, one of the ways of changing it, not the only way of changing it, one of the ways of changing it is to think about changing the start of the day. So for example, on most days I won't touch my email till later on in the morning. I'll spend the first part of the day deciding what's important from a logical, purely logical point of view, what's most important. So there's some, if you like, some day strategic thought. And I might do something that's more long-term, in the mid and long-term strategic thought and planning, and make some notes, which I can come back to later. Then I might do the think, decide, action stuff. And with a bit of luck, because I started my brain in that sense of thinking strategically about the day, I might be able to go back to that later on in the day. I'm really, if you like, exercising my mind muscle so that it's used to doing those things in the context of work on a reliable and consistent basis. So eventually it just becomes a habit. So if you're running around a lot, if you start your day with an hour and a half of emails, it's the last thing that you're doing in the evening is putting the kids to bed or something, and then spending an hour and a half with looking at your emails, then this might help you. There's another way, of course, of looking at fixing an issue of firefighting that really does infect your day, to the extent that at the end of the week you see, well, it's been busy and I've got a lot done, but actually have I moved forward? Are there things that I wanted to think about and develop that I actually didn't do, I never got round to? And if you're in that situation, other than thinking about the change at the beginning of the day, perhaps some thoughtful walking, but maybe if you have time for that, doing something else than work on the train, then the other thing would be to think about values, to think about the purpose and the values that relate to work and what it is you want to achieve. The other thing that some people do is to say, well, what am I paid for? Almost anyone can firefight, almost anyone can fix things, unless you're very, very technical. Most people who are managers can fix things. You don't have to be in your particular shoes to do it. So what can you do differently? I mean, you think about what is important about what you do. Why are you really paid? What is it that you really bring to your work that's important? And I think when we do that, we find that although the firefighting has a place, it should not dominate what we do in the context of work. If we do the firefighting and that's all we do, we're not really taking care of ourselves for tomorrow, and worse than that, we're not taking care of our team, and we're not taking care of our organisation.